In this demonstration, we're going to see how to build and execute a release in CA Continuous Delivery Director. To get started, I'll log in as the super user and point out that we have a release that we've already started called Email Services Deployment. Now, before we go into that one, we want to see the application that it's based on. So we'll go to Administration and Applications, and you'll see that one of them is Email Services. The Email Services application is one where we have defined three different environments: a development environment, a UAT environment, and a production environment, and we've defined which teams or groups and users will be enabled to take part in making changes to this release. All right, the QA team, the release team, the development team, and then our administrator, Jim, and our release manager, Sue. So those are the people involved. Now, all of this is important because when we define a release, we have to define phases around the different environments that we deploy to, and we're going to be assigning team members and groups to the different tasks in various capacities, and we want to get that set correctly. All right, so let's go back to our release now. And as I said, we've already begun creating it, but you can see that it's easy enough to begin simply by clicking on New Release here on this screen. The release definition is defined by the applications that are linked, the stakeholders that are linked and involved, and any token values that we'll use to define tasks later on. Let's take a quick look at the applications at least. In this case, as we already know, we've attached the email services application, and we've defined version 1.0 of that particular software or system that we're going to be deploying. We've also identified the content that is a part of this deployment. Part of it will be an Exchange server, a webmail service, an Active Directory link, all the things that are needed to enable email service for the organization. And then, as I said, we've got stakeholders as well. Jim Preety is our administrator. The QA team is involved, and others could be added as well. Now you can see that I've already got some phases, and remember that the release represents the workflow associated to doing this deployment. The deployment could be for a single application, as in my example, or it could be for many different applications simultaneously. In our case, we have a single application that is a part of this deployment. Each phase represents the workflow for some part of that deployment. And in my case, I've got the first phase being preparing the UAT environment with a couple of tasks already defined, then deploying the email services into the UAT environment. And then finally, once we've achieved that and everything is set to go, then we will deploy into the production environment. Keep in mind that as you build a release, all of these can be moved around. For example, I could move these from one side to the other, and so sequence is always going to be serial in this respect, and the same is going to be true with the task inside these phases. I can move them around. If I link them together, they'll execute in parallel, or I can make them so that they are serial or sequential in this case, and move them around like that. So you always have the option to do either or both. When you define phases, you'll see that there are a few settings. One is who are the owners of this task. In this case, preparing the UAT environment, we've made the development team to be responsible for that. Another option is how do we want to move from phase to phase. In this case, you notice that we have set this particular phase, and it's the first one, to be started manually, which means that uh, an administrator or the release manager needs to come in and activate or run this beginning phase. After that first one, however, they can be set in either of a couple of ways. One being, and by the way, this can be set as scheduled as well, so we could tell it that it is set to start on a certain date and time. After that first one runs, we can either set the following phases then as automatic, which means as soon as the first phase is concluded, the next phase will automatically start. Or it can also be scheduled to trip off at a certain date and time. There's a place here for a description, and finally a place where we select which environment does this particular phase target. Now, you're not necessarily required in a sense to always have environments identified, but it generally is a good idea, so that because you're scheduling work to be done against an environment, you may have scheduling conflicts and that sort of thing that you have to manage. And this is a way to help manage those, is by identifying which environments are being engaged at a particular point in time. All right, now as we have already said, we've got some tasks already defined here. And let's just take a look at one. You'll notice here that task, all of the ones that I have defined here, are described as manual task, although you have two different options. One is that it is a task that cannot be automated in some way by CA Continuous Delivery Director and a combination of other software, but it may be something that has to be done manually. It may be a validation, and there's no reasonable way to do the validation other than for someone to inspect the results and then confirm that the task is completed, or that it's not and that it needs to be restarted or something like that. Now, in other cases though, and let's add a task here, you have the option of using an automated task, and those will be based on the different plugins that you use. And the plugins enable CA/CDD to reach out to other systems and activate actions in those other systems, whether it is, for example, in release automation to start an automated release, to reach out to BlazeMeter and to start an automated test, or any of a number of different options that are possible. In my case, this is going to be a task to send a communication to the team that says we have completed the preparation of the UAT environment. So notify team of UAT availability. And to facilitate that, I'm going to have Sue be responsible for that since she's the release manager. And I'm going to say that this is a task that is going to take advantage of the ability to post a message to our Slack message board that the entire team uses. So we'll post a message, and we have to use the endpoint for Slack that's already been engaged, and then provide the various input parameters that are required. We need to tell it which team to notify, the FS team, and what is our message? And our message is that the UAT environment is prepared and ready for deployment. Now with that defined, you'll notice that our task now is identified in a different way. Rather than showing manual, it shows that it is taking advantage of the Slack plugin to post a message. And we can do that all through these steps that we have through the different phases. Now, when the release is completely defined and the time has come, then we can begin to execute the release. You'll notice here on the releases page, there's a symbol here for each of these releases, and that symbol indicates that it has been created, edited, but it is not yet running and it is not yet complete running. There will be different symbols for those statuses. So in this case, I'll go back to my release, and you'll notice the yellow symbol here allows me to run the phase. So let's do that. Now, when you tell it to run the phase, one of the things that I want you to notice is that each phase has that symbol independently, which means that the phases can be rerun if you need to. So this preparation step, you may do it once, but may need to do it again, or you may do your deployment and need to restart it for some reason. And so it lets you iteratively run a phase over and over and over again as the need is appropriate. In this case, I have started running the prepare UAT environment phase, and because the first task is a manual task, I'll have to manually tell it what its status is. I can come here and tell it that it is in this process of running. I can skip it. I can cause it to fail, or I can say that it's done. In this case, I'm going to say that it's done, and it will mark it as that way and automatically activate the next step. And in that way, we'll move through the various tasks. Let me move through the next one. Now you'll notice that my last task here is an automated task. So once the validate step has been done, then the notify team task will automatically activate. So let's do that. Let's mark it as done. And you can see that it is already fired off, completed, and has activated now the deploy to UAT phase. And now that one is active. And we'll go through the same process then of either telling that the task is done or letting the automated action run and work our way through to the end. Now you can see by a bit of magic I have worked my way to the end of this release, but I have one last task left to do. But before I do that, let's go back to the releases page and see the status as it's represented here for the email services deployment. You can see this blue symbol is shown here, meaning that it is in progress. Now, once it is completed, it will change again to a different symbol. Let's go now back to that final task, and we'll say that it's complete. And now you can see that the green symbol that represents the status of the phases, they're all a green circle with a check mark, so they're all completed. But you'll notice at the top here that it says that this release is still running. It's a very important point to note that you, as I said before, you can always rerun a phase as needed. So you may have run this deployment and thought everything was done, but it's not yet actually finished. So you can go back and rerun the deploy to UAT, rerun the deploy to prod, whatever it happens to be. You can do all of that over and over as needed until you say, yes, this release is done. And so that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to tell it to mark this release as done. And so now you see that it is marked as done. The symbols to actually execute the phases have disappeared, no longer available. Let's go back to the release page. And the status again has changed here for the email services deployment with that green circle representing the status as the release is done. Before we end this discussion, I'd like to note that each release that you have, it has a number of options related to it. One of them is to duplicate it. You can see I have a symbol here to duplicate it, which means that you can take the definition of that release, replicate it into a new instance, and then begin using it as if it had never run. You can then go back and edit it as you have need to, or whatever you need to do to run it again. So you cannot rerun a completed release, but you can make a duplicate of it to run a new instance. To learn more about CA Continuous Delivery Director, connect with other users, and share your own expertise, visit the CA.com product page by clicking the link shown here.